I was there for the birth of the Antichrist. Of course, I didn't know it was the Antichrist when I arrived at the house. I had been hired to take some photos. Nothing unusual there. I'm a wedding photographer by trade, but times are hard. I'll take any job, and you'd be surprised what sort of stuff people will pay you to capture. I'd never been booked for a birth before, but a job's a job, isn't it? They were birthing at home. I didn't ask why. My wife had our boy in the hospital. Insisted she wouldn't have anything for the pain, but quite understandably, she noped out after a few hours of contractions and had an epidural. I didn't really know how it would work at home, but I was pretty sure that an epidural wouldn't be an option, so whoever the mother was, I figured she was one brave lady. I pulled into the drive and was instantly glad to have taken the job. The place was huge, like an actual mansion. I'd charged them my standard wedding rate, but I just knew these guys would be good tippers. The first photos ever of their kid drawing their first breaths in the world. I was going to make some money, no doubt about it. You'd think the house they chose for the birth of the Antichrist would be like a horror movie set, wouldn't you? But it wasn't. There was nothing creepy about it, on the outside at least. Aside from its size, it was pretty normal. Whitewashed, freshly cut lawns, a couple of those big bushes that they trimmed into animal shapes. One was a crouching tiger, I think, and one was a wolf or maybe a dog, like a German shepherd. It was hard to tell. I mean, it was made out of fucking leaves. When I rang the doorbell, a man very quickly opened the door with a huge smile on his face. He had a black suit on as if he was going to a funeral, and his face was super white. And this is coming from a white man. He was pasty. His hair was jet black. His teeth were somehow even whiter than his skin, and I figured he must have had some sort of cosmetic cleaning or bleaching regime, or a skin problem. Either way, I figured he could afford to look weird because he was rich. He introduced himself as Mercurio, and held out his hand, which I shook. He was wearing white gloves. He ushered me inside, and thanked me for coming, told me to come upstairs with him. The hallway looked as normal as the hallway of a mansion can look to a guy like me who lives paycheck to paycheck, but I noticed it was lit up by candles. It was daytime, but I realised that all the curtains were closed, so no light was coming in the windows. The candles were all red, in silver sticks that were mounted evenly up the sides of the staircase, which was in the middle of the hallway. Mercurio was halfway up and beckoning me to follow, so I did. I didn't count the stairs, but there were a lot. I went up 3 flights, all with the same red candles mounted on the walls at either side before I ended up in front of a closed red door. 2 people, I couldn't see if they were men or women on account of the red, hooded robes they wore, stood at either side of it. Mercurio was still grinning and asked me if I was ready to do the job I was being paid for. I told him I was. He asked if I'd brought the Polaroid camera with the flash, and I said yes, of course. Now that I'd seen how terrible the lighting was, I was glad they'd insisted on it. He opened the door and gestured for me to go in. The door closed behind me and I realised that Mercurio hadn't followed. When my eyes got used to the darkness, I saw there were 6 more red-robed people on either side of what I assumed was a bed in front of me. But it had kind of a red drape thing at the foot of it, so I couldn't see who was in it. I stood there and put my hands behind my back because it seemed like a respectful thing to do. After a while, I guess maybe 10 minutes or so without anyone instructing me or speaking or making any noise at all, I decided to poke my head around the curtain to see what the fuck was happening. It was a bed, and a naked woman lay there, ankles and wrists tied to the corners of the frame. She was clearly very heavily pregnant. I didn't take much in about how she looked before I turned away from her in shock and disgust. I looked around at the hooded people for an explanation, but they didn't say anything. She didn't say anything either. I said to one of the hoods that I wasn't cool with this, and that I was going to call the police. They stayed silent. I moved to go and open the door to leave, but found it was locked. I pulled my phone out to call someone or send a message or something, anything, but it wasn't working. It was definitely charged because it showed up the no service message at the top of the screen. The wallpaper with my kid and I posing outside the museum just wasn't there. The screen was completely black except for the message. I unlocked it to dial and put on a speaker so these weirdos knew I was serious, but there was no dial tone. This weird noise was coming out of it, like someone breathing really fast, a bit like a dog that's too hot, but even faster. I don't know how I knew, but I knew it wasn't any dog. I dropped my phone when the woman screamed and I looked at her. Her whole body was straining. She was pushing. She was giving birth, and all the while she had this look on her face, not of pain, which she must have been in, but sadness. She looked like there was no hope left in the whole world. The hoods were all staring at me. Well, I guess they were. I still couldn't see their faces, but they had all turned toward me. I realised they were waiting for me to start doing my job. "Jesus Christ," I said. "You want me to take pictures of this?" They said nothing, but all turned back to look at the poor, grunting, sweating woman on the bed. When I took the job, I thought I'd be taking pictures of a newborn baby and his smiling mother, not some slave being forced to push out a child. I had no choice. I was here and I was trapped, and whilst I didn't know what the hell was going on, I figured that if I was going to get out of there, it was by doing what they said they would pay me to do. So, God help me, I started snapping. I don't know how long the whole thing took, but the camera flashed and I just let the Polaroid spill out onto the floor. I had to change the film at some point, which took longer than it should have because I was sweating and so terrified that if I took too long, something awful would happen to me, that I kept fumbling it. When the baby started to come out of her, I was in a daze, as if the situation wasn't quite real. Not exactly like a dream, just like I was watching events unfold from far away. I could see that the baby was red. It was covered in her blood, but I could see that its skin was crimson underneath. The woman had started to shrink, as if she was aging before my eyes. Her hair had started to grey and her limbs were getting thinner and thinner as the red baby emerged further. Soon she was near skeletal, and her eyes, now completely white, had shrunken into their sockets as she withered away, and her screams were now no more than feeble rasps and croaks. I looked one final time at the baby, and saw its little red hands grip the bedclothes, and it started to pull. It pulled itself out of her, face down onto the bed. As its legs came free, its mother, a living husk, let out a tiny pained squeak, and the thing lifted up its red, wet head before its eyes locked mine. I saw hell reflected in them, and I understood then exactly what I was looking at. It knew every lie I'd ever told, my every fear, my every dirty dream, and every sin and secret. I felt nothing but overwhelming, indescribable horror, and I began to scream, the hopeless scream of the damned, because it was all I could do. So helpless was I in that moment, looking at this thing that had come up from the abyss to rob my very soul of its mysteries from the inside out. I don't remember anything else after that moment. I was just home, alone, with no knowledge of how I'd made it back. I was almost too scared to check my bank balance, but sure enough, the money was there with a very generous tip on top. It was my blood money, my pieces of silver. I'm in their service now, and I know I can't leave it. I've been marked, and that thing will see me wherever I go on this earth. I understand now why the woman looked so utterly lost. She knew what she was bringing into this world, and where she was going for her troubles. My camera was gone, not that I couldn't afford a new one, but in my inside jacket pocket they'd left me with one single Polaroid. It was from somewhere midway through the birth. The woman didn't look too emaciated yet, and the baby's head seemed to only just be crowning. The hooded figures were there too, but behind them, at the head of the bed, something else. Another figure, only barely visible in the darkness, that I swear wasn't standing there when I was in that room. It towered over the others, a giant with ruined feathery wings spread out behind it, arms outstretched by its sides. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking right at the lens, right at me. The photo wasn't some grim keepsake. It was how they let me know that the baby's father had not missed the birth, and that by taking the job, I'd made the worst, most dreadful deal a mortal man can make.